All right, hello everyone. So thank you for that introduction. My name's Nata. I am a graduate student, soon to graduate, at Montana State University. But before I was a graduate student, I was a ski patroller. And I ski patrolled at a place called Castle Mountain Resort that's approximately there in southern Alberta. And for context, we're down here in Whitefish, so if you were to drive from one place to the other, you got to go all the way up and around and through Fernie and Sparwood. It's about 300 kilometers. But as the crow flies, Castle's only about 100 kilometers north of Whitefish. But one thing that's different about these two places is that Castle is quite front-rangey. So you can see its position on the eastern side of the mountains. So that's what I mean by front range, the east slope of the Rockies. And so if you look in one direction, if you look to the west, you just have mountains as far as the eye can see. It's pretty cool. If you look in the other direction, you can see right out to the prairies over there. And one thing about these front range mountains is that they're very windy. And I've often tried to explain to people what this is like, but I think it's sometimes better to show people. This is me and my good friend Jacinth. I think we were trying to go do sweep or something, I don't know. Average day in southern Alberta. Oh yeah, there I go, okay. And so I was on the forecast team at Castle, the ski hill forecast team for a couple years, and we dealt with wind slab problems pretty much every single day. Every day I was writing wind slab, stubborn, lee areas, you know. And most of you are probably pretty used to public forecasts. You probably you go to avalanche.org and you read the forecasts before you go out into the mountains. But what you might not know is that most ski hills have forecasters as well. And so we do the same thing. We go through the process, we write a forecast, and at the end, instead of typing that up for people to read, what we do is we use that forecast to help us plan our avalanche control for the day. And so I worked there as a forecaster, and I forecasted a lot of wind slabs. So when I went to grad school, I wanted to do something that would help make forecasting for wind slabs easier. And so my thesis project, which I talked about last night for those of you who were there, looks at how weather variables, things like temperature, wind speed, snowfall, influence the physical properties of a wind slab. Because physical properties, you know, they dictate things like how likely you are to trigger an avalanche, the size of the avalanche, and so I thought if we could learn about this link between weather and physical properties, I could help us gain information to write better forecasts in data-sparse, windy areas. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Today, I'm here to do a deep dive into what exactly is a wind slab. Because before you study something, you have to define it. You have to know what it is. And part of knowing what something is knowing what it isn't. And I think quite commonly, wind slabs and storm slabs are two terms that are used interchangeably by people, or not fully interchangeably, but with some overlap. And we know that one of the most important ways for us to stay safe in the mountains is good communication. And so if you're reading a forecast and you see wind slab on there, hopefully your idea of what a wind slab is matches the forecaster who wrote that forecast, matches their idea of what a wind slab is. If you travel to a new location and read a forecast somewhere else, hopefully that definition of wind slab is the same as the definition of wind slab used in your home range. And again, if you're a ski patroller and you're coming back on after days off and someone's explaining to you what you've missed, hopefully they're using these avalanche problems and thinking of them the same way you are. So communication is really key. All right, what I'm going to talk about some background of what is a wind slab, how do they form, why are they important, some definitions related to that. Then I'm going to go into an investigation I did to look at the extent of inconsistency between the terms wind slab and storm slab. And then I'm going to talk about why this is important to people, because why would I talk about this if it didn't have a relevance to us? Because it's interesting and I'm a huge nerd about semantics. But okay, first, background and definitions. So, what is a wind slab? How do they form? Why are they important? Okay, so how does a wind slab form? Well, snow falls to the ground, and then let's say the wind picks up and blows those snow grains somewhere else. It entrains them off the ground and moves them somewhere else. And one of the ways this can happen, this process called saltation is really important. And when snow grains saltate, they bounce along the ground, and they hit the ground, and they bounce into each other, and these nice branches on our snowflakes start to break off. And those grains, they become smaller and rounder. And we use the technical term rounds to describe these grains. And then when these rounds fall to the ground, the wind speed slows, or the wind takes them into a lee area where there's some eddying and deceleration of the wind. They fall to the ground, and when they fall to the ground, they pack densely together compared to those larger dendritic flakes. And because they're packed more densely together, they form more bonds. And because more bonds have formed between these grains, because they have a lot of surface area touching, they end up being stronger, because bond formation is one of the bases of strength in snow. So that's how these wind slab layers that are composed of these small grains end up stronger than snow, usually than snow that hasn't been transported by the wind. Another thing about wind slabs is they form in specific lee areas usually. So if you look at this picture, you can see that ridge where all the arrows start is pretty bare of snow. And then that gully is full of snow. And that gully is probably one big wind slab. So in this picture, you'd imagine the wind is probably coming kind of out of the screen in this direction towards us, taking the snow from the ridge to the gully. Pretty obvious. But it's not always this obvious, because sometimes wind directions change, or the wind direction up high doesn't match the wind direction down low, and you can be out wandering around in the mountains and you're not sure where you're going to run into a wind slab and potentially trigger a dangerous avalanche. So what we know about wind slabs, they form in specific areas. They're composed of small grains, and they're usually denser and stronger than other snow layers around them. So I had to write a definition of wind slab for my research. I said it was a layer of locally deep, dense, and strong snow composed of small, rounded grains and formed by the transport and deposition of snow by wind. And this combines a bunch of different definitions that were out there. So great, easy. Now we know what a wind slab is. Okay, so another term that we use is storm slab. Most of you have probably heard these terms from reading the forecast. And unlike a wind slab, which usually forms in specific areas, storm slabs are most generally widespread across the terrain. And they're usually short-lived beyond the extent of the storm period, usually. And so when snow falls straight down, usually we end up with more of a storm slab. But what happens in this situation when the snow is falling sideways? This is the top of Castle, standard view out of the top hut for me. When snow falls sideways, so it's storming, we have an ongoing storm, but it's also windy. And maybe what's happening is there is snow everywhere, and it is distributed across the terrain on all aspects, but it's slightly deeper and slightly more reactive in a lee area. Do we call this a wind slab, or do we call this a storm slab? And this was an argument we had all the time when I was working at Castle. We'd go out, we'd all have done the same avalanche control, we'd have seen the same avalanches, we'd been on the same snow, we'd been communicating all day, telling each other what we'd seen. We're all on the same page, and then we come to our afternoon meeting, and we get in this huge argument. Is this a wind slab or a storm slab? The amount of just unpaid overtime I did just arguing about this with my coworkers. And I eventually realized no one is wrong. We are all correct. It's a semantic difference. We're all describing the same thing. We just want to apply different terms to it. And I talked about how communication is so important in keeping us safe. So that's where I got the motivation to dive deeper into this. So 3 slides ago, we thought we knew what a storm slab or a wind slab was, but turns out it's actually not that simple, because there's this gray area in the middle where it's snowy and windy at the same time. And where do I draw the line between what's a wind slab and a storm slab? Where do all of you draw the line between what's a wind slab and a storm slab? Where do all these forecasters who are writing for all these areas across the West, where do they draw that line? And so that's what I wanted to find out. So I started doing some research, and I realized there's 2 different ways or 2 different forms of wind transport of snow. And these actually have terms associated with them. The first is redeposition. We're all pretty used to this. This is snow falls, sits there for some time, gets picked up, undergoes that process of saltation that I talked about, and is deposited somewhere else. And I think all of us in this room would probably agree, yep, that's a wind slab. But then there's this other term, back to this snow and wind at the same time, snow falling sideways. And the term I found for this is preferential deposition. And that is when snow is falling and it falls immediately into a lee area. And the difference is in redeposition, it's already touched the ground once and then it goes to a lee area. In preferential deposition, the first time it touches the ground, it ends up in that lee area. And so I really think this is probably where most of these arguments are coming from. I have to stand over here and get feedback, it sounds like. All right. So these terms, wind slab and storm slab, they seem pretty intuitive. We're all probably used to reading them. But they came from somewhere. And that place is from the conceptual model of avalanche hazard. People have been using these terms for a long time, but this paper was the first to start listing out all the different types of avalanche problems. So for those of you, again, that read the forecast regularly, these are all the different types of avalanche problems as defined in the conceptual model of avalanche hazard. And the point of this paper was to try and get forecasters speaking the same language, communicating with each other the same way. And I think it did quite a good job, but again, we're still having these arguments. So most forecasting in Canada and the US is based on this. When you read the forecast and you see a problem listed, a potential size, likelihood, and elevation and aspect, those are all specific parts of this conceptual model. So how does this conceptual model of avalanche hazard define these terms? Well, a storm slab is defined as a cohesive slab of soft, new snow, and it creates a short-term instability. Wind slab is defined as a cohesive slab of locally deep wind-deposited snow formed by the wind transport of falling snow or surface snow. And I want to highlight these two terms, falling snow and surface snow. Because to me, falling snow, that sounds a lot like preferential deposition. That's the deposition, or the preferential deposition of snow as it falls. Surface snow, that's that redeposition. And so when you look at it this way, it seems pretty obvious. Oh, if wind's involved at all, we call it a wind slab. But I think we've all been out in storms in the mountains, and it's very rare for a storm to actually happen without wind. And I think at times there's pretty good arguments for considering a preferential deposition more of a storm slab. And you could maybe say that preferential deposition kind of describes this weird in-between area. And further, what I call a storm slab or a wind slab might be different from what someone else calls a wind slab and a storm slab. Sometimes preferential deposition maybe acts more like a wind slab or acts more like a storm slab. And so what I started doing is I looked at previous studies that had already existed that talked about these two terms. And there was this study that was done looking at Avalanche Canada public bulletins. And they interviewed a few forecasters, and they talked about what wind speeds occur for a wind slab. And most of them agreed the wind speeds that form a wind slab are between 25 and 40 kilometers an hour. 25 being the minimum wind speed needed to entrain snow, 40 being about where snow starts to just blow away. But when they got into storm slabs, some people said, okay, we can only have a storm slab when winds are pretty calm. And some people said, yeah, winds that are calm up to maybe 30 kilometers an hour. Some people said maybe up to 40. Some people said up to 60. Well, that's a higher wind speed than other forecasters were saying was allowed for a wind slab. So you can see there's a lot of inconsistency in how storm slab is defined. And so I realized that storm slab was actually what I had to dig into. So I wanted to do my own investigation. Because most of these studies that exist looking into terminology look at public bulletins and look at just a few forecasters. And they do deeper case studies. I wanted to look at a much wider region and say, what is the extent of this inconsistency? And the other thing I wanted to do is when forecasters are writing a public bulletin, they need to think about how are people going to interpret this and how am I going to write this so that people understand. I wanted to look at how avalanche professionals themselves understand these terms without the pressure of having to communicate to the public, just communicate to each other. So I used the InfoX, which is this tool we have in Canada, and it's a data sharing platform for avalanche professionals. So in it, every single day, at the end of our day, we submit all our avalanche observations, we talk about the control work we did and our results. There's a snowpack summary for everywhere. You can track persistent weak layers in there. And there's this forecasting workflow based on this conceptual model where we're assigning avalanche problems every day. And so what I did is I had a sample period of time, and I went through the InfoX, it was very time-consuming, and looked at all storm slab submissions in that period. And then I recorded any storm slab that could be the result of preferential deposition. Because remember, preferential deposition is when that slab is on a lee aspect as the result of wind, but it was put there during a storm. And so how I did this is I had all aspect storm slabs, and then I looked at these aspect-dependent storm slabs. And if I came across an aspect-dependent storm slab, I would then, you also submit all your weather to the InfoX every day, so I would then go to that operation's weather that day and see if the winds were strong enough for transport, and this storm slab existed in the lee to the prevailing winds. I would say, okay, yeah, that is a preferential deposition storm slab. And I just recorded these storm slabs on the first day they popped up. And then I grouped by operation, because that's what I was interested in. How many operations are using these terms differently? And what I found is that in the sample period I did, which was only 1 month, 133 operations submitted at least one storm slab, and of these, 20%, so 1 in 5, submitted a preferential deposition storm slab. And if you remember back to those definitions I showed, that actually is not consistent with the definitions from the conceptual model, which is what our forecasting is based on. But if 20% of operations are doing it, there's obviously something there, right? And then I made this map, and this map is the Canadian forecast regions. And the numbers are the number of operations in each region that submitted a preferential deposition storm slab. The 2 just represents all the mountain parks as 1 unit. And so you can see that this issue of inconsistency, it's not necessarily confined to windy places. It's spread out through most of the mountainous areas of Canada. All right, so the conclusions I drew from this study are that there does appear to be discrepancy in how the term storm slab is used. This implies that there's probably inconsistency in how the term wind slab is being used in the Canadian avalanche industry. So let's talk about why this is important to us. You might be sitting here saying to yourself, well, I'm not an avalanche forecaster and I'm not Canadian, so why do I care? Okay, so importance. First of all, forecasters are people too. You know, the forecaster, I don't know, that wasn't meant to be funny. So avalanche forecasters in your region, they're people that they're paid to track the snowpack throughout the year. And it's their job to understand what's going on. They understand a lot more than the average person, and there's so much value in learning from them and reading the forecasts. But they're also subject to their own biases. I grew up and began my avalanche career in a really windy area. So I might be calling something a storm slab that someone who grew up here would call a wind slab, just because of how I was trained. And this likely applies to the US too. I did it in Canada because of the access to the data through the InfoX. It was easy to do, it was easy to get at, and people in Canada get really passionate when they get into these wind slab, storm slab arguments. And so I think this probably applies to the US as well, just based on conversations I've had. I'd love to extend this study to the US, maybe look at the National Avalanche Center database. And then what's really important, I think, is to read the comments in your forecast. Don't just look at the problems and stop there, because whoever wrote that forecast is going to, in the comments, really explain what is going on from what they've seen and from the submissions they've gotten from the public. And if you're taking out of that an appropriate strategy to mitigate your exposure to avalanches, in a way, who cares what we call it? If you're doing the right thing, the goal has been accomplished. And so with that, I want to thank my committee members, a few people I interviewed for project input, and very importantly, the Castle Mountain Ski Patrol forecast team, because I would never have gotten so deep into this without all of them. And yeah, thank you to all of you for coming here and listening to me talk about this. And I'm happy to take questions. I think we've got time for a few questions, so comments, other people's strong opinions.
So is
Okay.
the thing with like the preferential deposition being that sulfitation doesn't occur? So like the grains don't get rounded, you don't get the same density, same like strength of the slab.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, and a pretty astute observation. I think a big problem is, obviously, these two processes are happening largely at the same time. So the definition I first saw for preferential deposition, which was in a paper written by some Europeans, said deposition of snow by wind in the absence of erosion. So in general, yeah, that's part of it, is there's probably less saltation happening, and therefore the grains are becoming less round. So yeah, no, that is kind of, you're definitely getting the right idea. Okay, no other questions? Oh, never mind, okay.
So is there a correlation between, say, persistent weak layers underneath one of the types of slabs over the other one?
Oh, that is a whole other can of worms to open, is, yeah, when is a storm slab actually a persistent slab? People get in those arguments too. I would say, based on these definitions of storm slab and wind slab, both of them would be overlying a non-persistent weak layer, is how I would interpret those definitions and how they're usually used, but not always. Yeah?
Great presentation, Nata, thanks. How do you think scale influences how a forecaster assigns whether it's a wind slab or a storm slab?
Yeah.
In other words, if an operation is much smaller, then you might see something different based on the distribution of the problem across a operations forecast.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Yeah, forecasting at a ski hill versus forecasting for a whole region is quite different. At a ski hill, you just know every piece of terrain so well, and you can start off by saying, I think this slope will have this problem. And so I think you can be a little more specific when you know your terrain really well and your scale is smaller. When your scale is a whole mountain range scale, I know what Avalanche Canada does pretty much, I think they even have this built into their workflow, is that if it's actively storming, they just call it a storm slab because it's over such a wide area and there's probably some storm slabs and probably some wind slabs in there. So yeah, I think there's a huge difference in specificity with scale and difficulty. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you find that you have a different feel? Like, can you describe a different feel to a wind slab that's preferentially positive versus one that's more salty?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if people who have worked at the same operation have thoughts about this, but for us at Castle, we have this historical knowledge that's been passed down. We have this feature called red chair drift. Our unload area is kind of in a start zone, and we see it all the time. We stare out our top hat at it, and we think that we are more likely to have something unexpected happen there when it snows and then gets windy versus preferential deposition. And I'm not really sure why, but that's just this bit of local knowledge that's passed down. I think in a lot of cases, redeposition, you end up with a hard slab, and preferential deposition, you end up with a soft slab. And so that's why operations are using the term storm slab for it. And I think that's probably more likely in windy areas. That's my next step. I want to do some case studies into specific operations. But that's my thought right now. Awesome. Well, if there's no more questions, I will... Oh, okay, there is.
Do you think it could be useful to include a hardness range in the definitions between the two different slab types?
Yeah, and I think before the use of terms like storm slab and wind slab were really ubiquitous, we used the terms soft slab and hard slab a lot more. And so I think what a lot of people are doing, whether consciously or subconsciously, is using storm slab as soft slab and wind slab as hard slab, but that's not actually built into the definitions. But I do think that's how people are using them. Because hard versus soft, maybe if you're an operation that does active control work, maybe is more useful for you because it dictates whether you're ski cutting or using explosives. So yeah, I think by definition, there's not really space for hardness values in the definitions of storm slab, wind slab, but I think people are using them that way in a lot of cases. All right, great. Well, thank you all for having me. It's great to be in Whitefish.